One of the great things about being part of this movement of Centers for Spiritual Living, um, and being a minister in particular, being involved in it, is all of the conferences I've been to over the years. Those great places to go where you can rub up against like-minded people and you can listen to the great music and listen to the great lessons and talks and attend the workshops and just bask in the glory of this movement and the beauty of this movement, the sweetness of this movement. And when I first started going to conferences, I went to a lot of conferences that were very Centers for Spiritual Living centric. And they were, the various ministers and the various centers were represented there, and I got to know some people. And after time went by, I went to what I would consider to be metaphysical or new thought conferences as well. I went to a few of those. And one of the great things about going to those conferences, the ones that were larger in scope, was that I was able to meet and get to know and people from other organizations. And I'm thinking right now of Unity. There are other organizations, Divine Science and everything. But I'm thinking, for the sake of today's conversation I'm having with you, I think about Unity. And I went to a conference some years ago, and I got to know a couple of Unity ministers, and we we ended up eating lunch or something together, or sitting close to each other during one of the services or one of the main parts of the conference. And I think we attended a couple of workshops together. And so I saw them at 2 or 3 conferences, and each time that went by, I got to know them a little bit better. And so we would talk about Ernest Holmes, and we would talk about the Fillmores. And I would ask them questions about, because when you're part of a specific movement, you begin to develop a relationship with the founder or some of the old voices, the ancestors, so to speak. And so, we kind of develop relationships in our own way with the Transcendentalists and with Quimby and all those people who came down and the people who have come down to us through the ages, and definitely Ernest Holmes. And also I developed quite a relationship with Charles Fillmore in my own way, because I used him so much in ministry. He put together such a great collection of these academic books that he did around metaphor and allegory, looking deep into words, metaphysical interpretation and dictionary of the Bible, and other words that we use in metaphysics, the meaning of them. And so when I would hang out with Unity people, I would ask them questions about their relationship with Charles Fillmore, and they would talk to me about Ernest Holmes. And while Fillmore was seen as this incredible academic, and he definitely had a loving presence about him as well, but he was this great academic. Ernest Holmes, they would always say, they'd always want to talk to me about the mysticism of Ernest Holmes, because in the New Thought movement in metaphysics, Holmes was known as someone who was very mystical, and he brought those mystical qualities into his teachings. And so in the early days of the New Thought movement, all these different people who founded these movements and started out founding their own centers or churches or whatever, and doing their own classes, and so they would go out and they would start to kind of pick up a flavor from the way that they moved into spirituality. And while Charles Fillmore was seen as an academic in terms of the way he approached it, Ernest Holmes was seen not only as, because Ernest Holmes was brilliant and well read, but he was also very mystical. So this one day I was with these 2 ministers, and we were talking, and this woman, minister in Unity, she said to me, she said, well, I love Charles Fillmore and everything, but I got to tell you, Myrtle Fillmore is just like, she's like this aunt to me. She's like a grandmother. I just love her so dearly. And she talked about the fact that Myrtle Fillmore had a mysticism to her, but it was very much grounded in love and compassion and mercy and connection. Myrtle Fillmore, in terms of the whole idea of spirituality, was so deeply connected to the healing part of it and the nurturing part of it. And when we look at all the books that these early pioneers published and the things they talked about, Myrtle Fillmore has 2 books to her credit. One of them is called Healing Letter, and the second book is How to Let God Help You. And in talking to this woman, now I learned about Myrtle Fillmore in my ministerial training, but in talking to her and feeling her emotions and her affection for Myrtle Fillmore, her connection, I returned to my center, and right away I set out to get a copy of the book Healing Letter. And I picked it up, and my understanding is that it's not that Myrtle Fillmore sat down to write a book, it's that she would write letters to people as a practitioner or as a metaphysical worker, to work with clients, for lack of a better term, or people who would seek her out, other seekers and people, but these were people who were dealing with challenges and maladies and shadow in their own life. And Myrtle Fillmore, some of them she had to correspond with, and she wrote letters. And the book is made up of those letters. And I started to go through it, and I found that it was incredibly powerful. And you could feel in her language and the structures of how she wrote and her punctuation and how she laid it out, you could feel a calm and a slowness and a presence of just being with somebody, looking them in the eye and putting her arm around them and caring so deeply for them. It just reeked of this, in her writing. And I wanted to do a class on her, and I took this book, which is a very small book, and I started a class, and I kind of went through it from an academic point of view, how you lay out a class and your outline and syllabus and, where we're going to start and where we're going to finish. I found it incredibly hard to put into a structure like that. But I persevered, and I did it in kind of an awkward way, and I kind of laid it out. And I started the class, and there was a lot of interest in it, and people signed up, and we put together, because the material was small in nature, it was only a 2 or 3 week class, or maybe 4 week class. I think it was a 3 week class. And the amazing thing is that once we got started, my outlining and my putting it together, my organization began to fall apart, because what the people who attended the class, they had bought the book themselves in preparation of the class, and they started reading it, and they fell in love with her. And just like the Unity minister I talked to was, I feel like she's my aunt. I feel like she's my grandmother. I feel like she's a wise woman somewhere who's sitting on a front porch, and maybe a midwife or something, and you come and you're not feeling really good, and you hang out, and here's this person who just says, basically, hey, honey, come here, have a seat, sit with me, sit with me for a while. And Myrtle Fillmore's work was such, and in investigating her, what I found out is that when she did her own prayer work, it was an enormous practice that she would go into. And I'm talking, in the enormity that I'm talking about is the time and the presence. And she would talk about going into parts of her body and being present and being loving and being questioning and wanting to know what was going on there and wanting to know what was felt there. It was so incredibly metaphysical. It was, in metaphysics, we equate parts of our body with our different experiences, what does the core of our lungs and heart, what does that represent? What does our head represent? What do our hands represent? What are all these things and the various organs? And there's this great rich tradition within New Thought and metaphysics, but Myrtle Fillmore took it to another level. She took that idea, but she also opened herself up to travel, in her own way into that part of a body and be open and basically say, I have some idea of what you're about. I have some idea, how you are, knee, ankle, heart, lungs, whatever, but let me be present with you. And her way of prayer was to enter into a place and to sit in this intuition and to just simply be with it, to simply spend time, to simply engage in a completely free form of communication. I found when I got into the way she prayed to be incredibly challenged by it, because I think that I was so concerned about getting my formula right that we sometimes do around prayer and metaphysics, and there's a reason for the formulas. I'm not disrespectful of that. To be able to come into prayer from an affirmative alignment, opening up with it, I respect that. But I think that I was so hung up on the formula and making sure that I did my release and I let go and I did all that properly, to have someone direct me through her writing and what I learned about her to say, Andy, simply go, simply show up, simply be present. Be present. In other words, she made it very clear that in order for healing to take place, presence was such a huge part of it. And Ernest Holmes was the same way. I mean, he wrote about, he talked to people, he spoke of this and he wrote about it in his own way, saying that the work takes as long as it takes. I will work with a client, or I will work with a seeker. I will work with someone who's challenged as long as it takes. I will be present. He talked about that. But Myrtle Fillmore, actually somehow for me communicated that in a way that I didn't pick up what Ernest Holmes was really saying there until I encountered her. So I was thinking about that influence in our movement, the influence of the presence of what I would say today, and this is kind of the direction I want to go with this, is to embody, if we think about ourselves as beings, and we think about the different energies that we carry with us, the sacred energies, the physical energies, the psychological energies, the emotional energies, that there's a part of us, we know the teaching is that we are made up of a combination of energies, and really, in order to live a life that is the life we're all looking to live in terms of peace and joy and connection and meaning, is to be in balance, to balance those energies. So what did Myrtle Fillmore represent in that, in terms of that movement, in terms of my experience with her, and in terms of the experience I've seen other people have with her? Well, oddly enough, I'm going to refer to her husband, Charles Fillmore. And Charles Fillmore had a philosophy in his teaching that, he was very Bible-centric. And I know Ernest Holmes was too. And Charles Fillmore believed that the book itself, this piece of literature, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the way it was laid out, he said was a perfect metaphorical and allegorical example of evolution. And he talked about the fact that the Old Testament and the New Testament are representations of different places on the evolutionary path. So we look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament is filled with tribal information. It's filled with fire and brimstone. It's filled with a God who is very masculine and male-centric, a God who will smite the enemies, a God who will direct, a God who will expect people to show up in a particular way, a God who will create pillars of salt and all that stuff, a burning bush, the great I am, the great voice, a very powerful presence. And Charles Fillmore talked about the fact that God is, that part of the balance is important because we have to remember the raw power of God. When we think of it in science, We think about the scientific tables. We think about the laws. We think about the Big Bang. I mean, can you imagine the energies that were there for the Big Bang when this universe started? And all that power that was there, and all that intention, and all that creative force, and all that freedom, and all that, the rawness of it, and how it exploded into the universe from consciousness. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was directed, and it was intentional, and it was there. It was solid. It was the foundation. And so Fillmore talked about the idea in his, Charles Fillmore, you move through the Old Testament and then you come into the New Testament. And the New Testament embodies a different energy. It assumes that, okay, we have the power of God. We get that. Now, how do we bring that forward with love? How do we bring that forward with connection? And so we have this individual, Jesus, come forward, and he shows up in a very different kind of way. But what's interesting to me in this, in the way that I've studied it, and I'm going to sit here and be honest with you, I don't know if Fillmore takes this on directly. But when you look at his definitions of Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, in terms of when you come from the Old Testament, to put Mary in there in the role that she was in. Now, there were women in the Old Testament, and there were different levels of the feminine energies, the sacred feminine. But Mary comes forward in a really interesting way, because in the Jewish tradition, there was all this tribal lineages and who was related to who and what tribes they were in and all of that. Then we have Mary, and what we know about Mary was that she was someone who was present, and they refer, she's referred to as that perfect vessel. Because without Mary, Jesus does not come forward. And so this change, let's call it the Jesus idea. Let's go, this time of the year we celebrate the birth of the Christ consciousness. That's what the Christmas season is about. All the metaphor, all the allegory about how the Christ comes forward in each and every one of us. What is the Christ? It's a higher ideal. It's the Buddha nature. It's the heart-centered living. It is our word coming through us. Ernest Holmes and all of those people did so much work on defining the Christ at highest among us. And the Christ, of course, existed in the Old Testament. But then we come into the New Testament where there's a finer point put on the teaching, connection, healing, presence, love, affection. We think about Jesus, we think about him being with the multitude on the hillsides, and we think about him being with the lepers, and we think about him hanging out with 12 laborers, and we think about his relationship with women and Mary Magdalene and all these other people. But what was the vessel by which he came through? We have this Mary link that comes through, the sacred feminine. And that's it's interesting to me, because when I think about what Fillmore uncovered with all of his work in academia, then you have Myrtle Fillmore, who comes forward with actually her way of being, her way of praying, her way of showing up in our own life and in the life of others as a feminine quality. It's about, my uncle's going to help me get a job, but my auntie, she wants me to come by and have a cup of coffee with her. And we're going to hang out for a while, and we're going to talk. And she's going to love me, and she's going to care for me. And she's going to accept me. I worked for years as a group counselor in the world of corrections. And sometimes, every once in a while, I would pull the job of when people would get visits from their families. And I would sit in a room, and I noticed that, the families would show up, sometimes an extended family. And it was very interesting when grandma was there, and auntie was there, and there'd be all this, they'd be eating lunch together, and they'd be talking and laughing, and who's doing what and what's going on, and they'd be giving each other advice, and they'd be telling the person I'm working with what's wrong with you and all this stuff. And then there was that, at some point when all that noise and activity died down, it was auntie or grandma who would kind of take the center, and very often it was very quiet, and it was holding a hand, and it was, I love you, baby. I don't want to see you here. I want to see you free. I love you. I miss you. I want to work in the garden with you. See, that time, that space, that acceptance. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have Mary, and in the Buddhist tradition, Buddhism talks about achieving the Buddha, achieving enlightenment. And we have, Siddhartha becoming the Buddha. But then there's this other character that emerges her name was Kuan Yin. And she is the embodiment of that. And I know that we have to be careful of the iconography, people who create different artworks depicting people and ideas, but I know with the Buddha, the classic Buddha iconography, the statues, the tchotchkes or whatever, with the Buddha in that place of meditation, and the eyes lowered and very upright and gorgeous and perfect posture, and it can be a little bit intimidating. And the iconography of the Kuan Yin is mostly very inviting. Her posture is welcoming. Her hands are open. She's looking at you. She wants to see you. She is referred to as the deity of compassion and mercy and presence. And there's a lot of stories. There's a lot of stories about Kuan Yin, and it depends on what region you're talking about. But one story is that there was a boy who was growing up, and he had a father who his father had a very heavy, big energy in the family, and his father had some very strong ideas, and he kind of ruled the family with an iron hand, so to speak, and he could be sometimes a little bit abusive, and he wanted the most from his children, and he wanted them to live in intention and create and move forward and move beyond, and he was a little bit hard on everybody, and this one child, this boy, was trying so desperately to please his father, but he didn't seem to really have quite the right personality, or he wasn't really kind of catching on to things, and he and his father were at great odds. And he grows up, or he starts to grow up, and he turns the age of 13. And 13 is interesting, especially for boys, because that's when sometimes the hormones kick in, and the strength begins to come, and the size comes. And so boys can start to become aggressive. And that's why we see them play football and hockey and all these other sports. And that aggression and moving forward and wanting to build things, and they can be destructive, and they want to drive cars fast and all that sort of thing. They can't wait to do that. 13 is a really interesting age. But at 13, he found himself in a great deal of angst, and he realized he was becoming his father, and somehow it horrified him, and he didn't know what to do with that. And so he desperately wanted somehow a change to take place so he didn't have to go in that direction. And the story goes that he went to sleep, and he woke up the next morning as Kuan Yin. He had morphed into the feminine. But what's interesting about this, because it's not just going from a boy to a girl, it's about, within the story is the embodiment of the energies. He never forgot the energies of being male, but now he took on the energies of being feminine. So he had the masculine and the feminine. And we asked the question is, how is Kuan Yin so loving? How is she so compassionate? How is she have such mercy? Because she remembers what it is to have the aggression and the dark side of that and the hurtful side of it. The unhealthy masculine, she knows what that's like. And so she shows up in that place. And so now we have a Jesus in the biblical sense who somehow has understands the masculine, but also understands the feminine and is able to spend time. Jesus says, suffer the little children to come unto me. That's not something you're going to see in the Old Testament. I'm going to go hang out with the lepers today. You ain't going to see that in the Old Testament. I'm going to move beyond the temple. I mean, really, in Judaism, I'm going to move beyond the temple and go hang out in the hillside with the farmers and talk about mustard seeds and allegory and all that sort of thing. I'm going to speak their language. I'm just going to be with them. I'm going to say in front of a prostitute, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I'm going to show compassion, pick up your bed and walk. Today you shall see, even though you haven't seen. And I'm going to spread the mud on your eyes and be with you. I'm going to touch you. These 12 guys he hung out with, he went out and rode around in a boat with. That is the present. That's Myrtle Fillmore going right to it. That's Mary. That's Kuan Yin coming forward. And the reason I called today's talk Her Gift is because we're in the season of giving. We're in the Christmas season, the holiday season. And I look around, and I'm going to be quite blunt about this. In the last year or so, we have all been through incredibly large challenges as a culture and as a larger community. And can you think, in my lifetime, I can't think of a better time when we need some Kuan Yin, some Mary, and some Myrtle Fillmore. I heard recently someone said, why do we think in America all this stuff is coming up all of a sudden, all this racial stuff, all this unrest, people feeling forgotten, people feeling left behind, anger, taking to the streets? And this particular political expert, who I thought was brilliant, he said, because this is the stuff that we haven't dealt with in our personal history as a country. And I thought, this is Myrtle Fillmore. These are the parts of the body we haven't visited. We haven't spent time there. We haven't hung out there. We haven't said, how are you doing? Can I be present for you? And I want to end with a very personal story. We're coming into the holiday season, and this is very unusual for me. I don't generally read something that I write out of hand, but I want to read something. It's very quick. It's very short. And this has to do with a personal experience I'm having right now. My lifelong loved one shared a challenge with me. In that moment, I intensely became aware of an all-consuming sense of compassion based on looking past the lines on our faces and the gray strands in our hair and seeing instead her face as that kid we used to be. Afraid. I recently had someone come forward who has known me longer than anyone in the world has known me, and with a challenge. Let's call it a physical challenge. Hey, Andy, by the way, I found this out. And, it said, well, gee, you can do this, do that. What the doctor, what's what medication, it was like simply at that moment, what flooded over me was to come forward with my presence. I love you. I want to be with you. Let's talk about how you feel. Let's talk about your fears. Let's talk about your tears. Is that the greatest gift that we can be compelled to give? In this season, in this time, in our history, this time we are living in, and with each other. I am so eternally grateful for that part of the sacred feminine that is what it is, and is a great teacher to us. And that is my wish for all of us in the holiday season, that she will very much be present with all of us. So namaste. Thank you very much.